why standing stones? We picked this. I picked this a little while ago with this theme, but there's a reason for it. With a standing stone. How many? How many in here have been to like a nationally or even internationally recognized memorial or monument? What are some of them that you've been to that probably stand out more than others? Rushmore, Mount Rushmore, and that's a great one. And of course, you can look at the history behind that and how that came about and why they put those four men up there. I know there's a few others that probably want their faces put up there, and I don't know, maybe at some point they will, I don't know. Mount Rushmore, any other ones? The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which is really interesting. How many have been to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier? There's a really interesting story. I'm not going to go over it right now, but just the way the soldier, that is assigned to that is really interesting. I was actually, and every country seems to have a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. I remember doing a mission work in Russia, and they have a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. In fact, they have a statue up in Murmansk that is about probably 75 to 100 feet tall. It's really big for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and people from all over the world will bring and lay wreaths at the foot of this statue. So we've got the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, Rushmore. Any other ones? Memorials that kind of stand out. I know there's more than two. How many of you here have been to New York to see the Ground Zero and the 9/11 memorial? Pretty emotional with that, and remembering what happened. Why do people build memorials? Why do they build these tangible statues? To remember what happened. That's exactly what they are built for. It's to remind people that something in this place happened that was very significant. And we look back at all of these different things, and of course there's a lot of controversy because some of them have been torn down. There's other ones that are put up that get people upset sometimes, but nonetheless they are historical. It's things that just happened, and that's why these things are built for that place. And that's exactly the reason why I chose standing stones for this, is because standing stones is a very literal term, and it's a figurative term as well when we start looking at the biblical connotations with it. I want to take you all the way back to the end of the Exodus. Of course, none of us are there, but we've read about this. We've read during the 40 years, if you've read the first 5 books of the Old Testament, you see Moses' account of what happened to the Jews and what happened before they left Egypt, what happened after they left Egypt, and the reasons why it took 40 years for them to get through the wilderness. It wasn't just, they weren't just wandering around with no compass and no map or anything like that. But remember, the Lord told them for every, there was a reason why they would take them 40 years to go through the Exodus, and it was because of doubts that they had. And remember, Moses sent Joshua and Caleb ahead to scout the land of Canaan. And of course, they come back with the other spies, and they don't give, the account that Moses wants them to give, or God wants them to give, and has the confidence in it. And so he tells them 40 years. But I want to take you to the end of this 40 years. Imagine being back there, 40 years, wondering who would make it. How many in here are under 40 years old? Imagine your whole life is spent in the wilderness. You're born in the wilderness. And you're born at a time that you're saying, this is where we want to go, and your whole life that is just one big trek, one big voyage, journey, trying to find this place that you're supposed to be, that the Lord wants you in that place. And you wake up every day, and all you do is just look forward to the next day of traveling. But along this way, it's not going to be the easy. It's not just a hike. It's not just walking from day to day, but it's facing a lot of different opposition along the way. That's what it was like for them. Imagine spending 1/3 of your life facing unpredictable surroundings, unpredictable terrain. Most of the strangers that you meet along the way are enemies of God, and they would either attack you or just lead a lot of your people astray. There were people that had fallen, that did not believe in God. They believed in paganism, a lot of polytheism that was happening, their own gods that they have conjured up, and then they choose to just follow that. And you're in the company of thousands and thousands of people, many of which you know who fall away into something like this. A lot of people spent their last years on earth pushing towards the final destination, and that's all they knew. A lot of the young people spent their entire childhood growing up in this wilderness environment. That's all that life was that they knew. Imagine at the end of this 40 years, the man who led you through all of this, the one you looked to for leadership, the one you looked to for guidance, the one you would trust, the one that people murmured against time and time again, the one who trusted him after he could show what God did, Moses, has passed away because of one thing that he did that displeased the Lord. Many people look at that striking of the rock as just very minimal, asking, well, what's the big deal about it? But it goes to show us just how important and how vital it is that we follow God exactly how God tells us to do things and give him the glory. That's one of his shortcomings with striking this rock. He never gave God the glory for what he did. And because of that, Moses never was not going to be able to see what he spent 40 years of his life and beyond trying to reach. And so the leader for the last 40 years has died, and a man that was the head of the military all that time was a man named Joshua, who was promoted to lead the Jews. What footsteps he had to fill. God promoted him. God ordained him into that, and the people knew that this was going to be the one. In fact, before he died, it was Moses who puts him before the people and says, this is going to be your leader. This is going to be the one to lead all of you to where you want to be. And so Joshua, people are still wondering, are we going to finally make it? Isn't it interesting? 40 years that they spent, and they're finally at the threshold, finally at the doorstep of Canaan. And it didn't have to be like that. You realize, you think of this. This could have happened 40 years ago had people followed God and trusted him and trusted their leaders to get them into where God wanted them to be. But 40 years has gone by, and they finally received the news of which everyone has been anticipating. First and foremost, Joshua. Now therefore arise and go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel. Joshua chapter 1 and verse 2. In fact, when you look at chapter 1 and verse 2, or chapter 1 and 2 of Joshua, we get the whole preparations of getting ready to cross the Jordan. And if you ever look at a map, and I was going to show it, I didn't get to it, but there's the Jordan that's separating them from this land of Canaan. And when you read the first couple of chapters, it's preparing to cross over this Jordan, to go into the land of Canaan. But the Jordan was not just a regular river. In fact, at the time that they were crossing, it would have been very high. It would have been very high. And so they needed someone, somehow, some way to cross that Jordan. And so they prepared to cross it, but now the time has finally come. And that's what kind of brings us to where we're really going to focus on this morning. If you look over at Joshua chapter 3. In fact, we're going to look at chapter 3 and chapter 4 with the time that we have this morning. Looking at the crossing of the Jordan, but not just looking at such an extraordinary feat. Looking at what happens afterwards and how they commemorate this whole occasion. In Joshua chapter 3, in verse 5, and first couple of verses right here, it talks about how he rose in the early morning. He got all the children of Israel together. He lodged. He was ready to go with it. And then they would bring in the Ark of the Covenant. And the way the Ark of the Covenant, the way that the whole layout was going to be, is that he gets men to, the proper men, the ones who are supposed to carry the Ark, to lift it up and carry it, and everyone else was supposed to stay a distance. And these men that were going to be carrying the Ark are going to set foot into the Jordan. And the moment that they set foot into that Jordan, there's a miracle that takes place. And I have a feeling the reason why, when Joshua, that there's a distance between the Ark and the rest of the people, when you're talking about thousands and thousands of people, it's not going to be so easily seen if they're crowding the Ark, is it? But when you stand back and God resides in that Ark, that's where God's dwelling place is. And we know that God is with us as long as that Ark is being carried at that time. And it brings us to verse 5. Joshua said to the people, "Sanctify yourself." What does sanctify mean? To set apart. So he's telling them, he says, you set yourselves apart. You are people that are like no other people that are on the earth. He says, you set yourselves apart, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And then Joshua spoke to the priests, saying, take up the Ark of the Covenant and cross over before the people. And so they took up the Ark of the Covenant and went before the people. That word, sanctify does not just mean to set apart. It means to purify. There's something very special and very peculiar, very different about who you are when you sanctify. When we see that word sanctification in Scripture, it's a word that makes, that separates certain kinds of people on a spiritual level. But he's telling them to purify yourselves or to prepare yourselves. Why? Because you are about to witness God's power once again. You think of this, a lot of the people that were already here had seen the waters part once in their life. Not all of them. We know that there are many new ones that we read about, but there were some that were there that remembered that day. God parted the Red Sea. And here he is again parting the Jordan River so that they could walk through and get to where they need to go. You see, the danger is to forget what the Lord is capable of doing. That's what a lot of them fell short. But you think now they're finally getting things correct. You look at verse 7. It says, the Lord said to Joshua, this day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. And you shall command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant, saying, when you have come to the edge of the water of the Jordan, you shall stand in the Jordan. And so Joshua said to the children of Israel, come here and hear the words by the Lord your God. And Joshua said, by this you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the very people who stood in their way from 40 years ago. It's the same group of people. The Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Jebusites. And so Joshua was given the authority of all the people. God's telling him, you listen to him, and you're going to get to where you need to go. And he assures them, Joshua, that God is directing them, and that the orders are coming from him. What an exciting time that must have been. How anxious they must have been. You see, this is preceding Jericho. This is preceding all of the things that are happening in there. But what a time that must have been. After 40 long years of everything behind them and all the battles that had stood in their way, all the attacks that had happened to them, now they're finally at the doorstep, right there, Jericho. And Canaan is ready to be taken. They knew that they would battle those who had gods that were made of wood and stone and earth, but they knew that they had a mission. And you look at verse 11, it says, "Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is crossing over before you into the Jordan. And now therefore, take for yourselves 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 man from every tribe. And it shall come to pass, as soon as the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, that the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, the waters that come down from upstream, and they shall stand as a heap. And so it was when the people set out from their camp to cross over the Jordan, with the priests bearing the ark of the covenant before the people. And as those who bore the ark came to the Jordan, and at the feet of the priests who bore the ark dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks during the whole time of harvest, that the waters which came down from upstream," what does it say? "Stood still, and rose in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zaretan. And so the waters that went down into the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, failed and were cut off, and the people crossed over opposite of Jericho. And then the priests who bore the ark of the covenant, the Lord, stood firm on the dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel crossed over on dry ground until all the people had crossed completely over the Jordan." And so you have all these details of crossing it, just exactly as how Joshua said it was going to happen. You know, you think of the flood season and just the banks overflowing. Can you imagine just seeing this gushing river? And the moment those men were carrying the ark setting foot on that bank, all of a sudden those waters part and they stop. I want to pause there because I've heard some critics along the way, and you may have as well, these higher critics that try to cause a lot of confusion with the Bible students. I've heard them say things like, well, it wasn't really, that deep, and they they misinterpret a lot of things. They say, well, it was actually the Reed Sea, and it was just a different area of the Red Sea that they parted, or that they had crossed, and they said that there was, that they had gone up to where it was just not very, that it was just kind of a marshy area to cross the Red Sea. It's the same kind of arguments they tried to make for the Jordan River. Same kind of arguments that they made for the Red Sea when that was parted. You're always going to have your critics that try to cause this kind of confusion. But if you can read Scripture the way that God has revealed it to us, and it doesn't take very much to look geographically at what these areas are. You can look on a map even today, or from several years ago, and see what these waters really were like at the time of year. There was a miracle that took place. And so we see that with this flood season, that they do exactly as God said, and the priests went first just as they were instructed. What an amazing sight that must have been. And how excited, hyped up these people must have been, knowing these 40 years are finally behind us, and all we have to look forward to are these battles. And there were a lot of battles that happened in Canaan, beginning with the miraculous things that happened at Jericho. But then we get to chapter 5, or chapter 4 rather, and we see exactly why we've decided on the theme that we're calling this. And it came to pass when all the people had completely crossed over the Jordan that the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, "Take for yourselves 12 men from the people, 1 man from every tribe, and command them, saying, Take for yourselves 12 stones from here, out of the midst of the Jordan." So we have, in fact, when we start looking at this, and we'll look at all the details to fill it in, there's actually 2 sets of stones that they're going to be dealing with right here. And how significant this was to the people. He says, "Take for yourselves 12 stones from here, out of the midst of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet stood firm, and you shall carry them over with you, and leave them in the lodging place where you lodge tonight." And then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the children of Israel, 1 man from every tribe. And Joshua said to them, cross over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and each one of you take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel. I want to pause right there as well, because it's always interesting to me to see how artists render the scriptures, because you see a lot of illustrations, don't we? When people are deciphering the Bible, or when they're trying to put into pictures what they think the Bible means. And I've actually seen pictures of people carrying these little rocks about the size of your fist. With him carrying these rocks up and out of the Jordan River. But that's not the size that he's talking about right here. These are men that are wielding these huge rocks on their shoulder. And there's a reason for that. Because these are going to be something that were not going to be able to be moved, something that people were not going to be able to miss with this. So he says take up a stone on your shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of his children of Israel, that this may be a sign among you when your children ask in time to come, saying, what do these stones mean to you? And then you shall answer them, and say that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for a memorial to the children of Israel forever. And the children of Israel did so, just as Joshua commanded, and took up the 12 stones from the midst of the Jordan, as the Lord had spoken to Joshua, according to the number of tribes of the children of Israel, and carried them over with them to the place where they lodged, and laid them down there. When you look at memorials, that's exactly, memorials are to commemorate something, aren't they? We have memorials to remind us of certain things. In fact, there's a memorial that we take every first day of the week. It's a memorial that the time that he sat down with his apostles, the night before he died, said, this is a memorial I want you to do. And you think from every first day of the week, every single week from that time forward, those who were faithful to him, it never failed. They took that bread, they took the fruit of the vine, and remembered him. It's interesting when you start looking back at this, because I think sometimes we get a little disconnected sometimes from when that happened, because we read about the night that takes place, isn't it? That the night, when we build it up and how important it was, and certainly that is the most relevant thing that ever happened to us in the history of anything, is Christ going to the cross. But when he sat with his apostles that night, we see how he took that, that supper, and telling them, I want you to remember me by these two things. One which will be my body, and one which will be my blood. And then the next time we talk about it, we don't see anything until Paul's letter to Corinth. And then we read about that, and we see a lot of people. But folks, there's a lot of time in between that night that Christ was going to that Christ was going to be betrayed, and Paul's letter. Can you imagine just from that time forward? Because he raised, 3 days went by, and then the tomb was empty. And we know everything that took place, all of the storms and everything, the tragedy that took place after those 3 days, and during those 3 days, people realizing what they had done. That they just put the Son of God up on that cross, that they just pounded those nails into his flesh. They pounded that crown of thorns. They scourged him and put him into that tomb, which couldn't hold him. But then we'd stop for some reason. But they didn't. Because according to Christ and according to Paul, that would have taken place. Can you imagine that first Lord's Supper after his death and how emotional that must have been? We read a lot about how emotional it was when he appears to people, and how people didn't, either didn't recognize him or they just were in such shock that he was back the way that he said he would be. But can you imagine that first Lord's Supper 1 week later? And then and then it keep happening. And every time they remembered that night. We've had people in our lives that have passed away, and we remember them, don't we? There are things that we place. Sometimes it's a room that we just don't touch. We want it to look exactly like it did if it's a child or a loved one. We put figures out, or we put wall hangings or different things that remind us. In fact, when you attend a memorial for someone, that's exactly what it is a memorial, and we say things about them. But have you ever noticed that a lot of these things that when you go out into the foyer, what do they put out there besides the guest book? They have a picture of them. They have different things that were very close to them, weren't they? Different things in their life, different accomplishments, medals, whatever the case might be, and we like to put them on display so people can see. We pay a lot of homage to the military because we'll put medals out from the military. We'll even put their uniforms out from the military to see what they were, and remember them. And there are ways for us to remember that individual. That's what a memorial is. I can't imagine how emotional it must have been. There are weeks that when we meet in front of here, when you really start meditating on what Christ did for you and for me, that you just can't help but to tear up. And when you really start thinking about why we do what we do every single week, I can't even imagine what they must have felt when that first week went by. And then when they met again to take it. And then when they met again. I get scared sometimes when someone close passes away. And I get scared because I know the time that I spent with them, and aside from the fact that I just know I can't ever call them again, I know that I should, they're friends of mine, or one in particular, that we would call each other several times a week just to chat Bible. And now they're gone, and I know, and there'll be times that I'll be sitting in my office, and I'll be looking at a passage, and I reach for the phone, and I realize, can't do that. But my biggest scare is, as time goes by, that what if I remember them a little bit less? You ever wonder that? And then a little bit less. And then and then there's weeks that go by that I just don't think about them. And then you feel guilty, and then you go through all of the roller coaster of emotions. But the memorials are there so that we remember. And that's exactly what Joshua is having them do right here. He's saying this is the biggest thing that has ever happened in your life. We're going to go in to a place that we've never been, facing people in opposition that we have never faced, having been unsure all this time, being scared like we were 40 years ago. These men were built for war. They're big. They're bigger than us. In fact, they're so big that we're like grasshoppers to them. That's what all the spies said when they came back. But now God's leading us in. And when you look at crossing the Jordan the way that they did, he's saying, I want you to take these stones from the midst of the Jordan and put them in Gilgal, where we're going to be camping. Why, Joshua? Because I don't want you ever to forget what God has done for you. What do these stones mean to you? to remember what God could do. To remember every single thing that he has done to get you to this point. Have you ever thought about that? We get scared, wondering, right now, because we always live in the now, don't we? Am I going to make it through today? Am I going to make it through this period of time for me? And then we stop and we can pause and look back at everything in our life that God has gotten us through. And then it all kind of becomes clear. And we get the right perspective of this. That we've had some rough spots. And some times that we never thought we could get through. But here I am today. And God's gotten me to this point. And it's going to be okay. That doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to get over it or anything that's happened or any loved one that I've lost. But while I might not be able to get over it, I know that God's going to help me get through it. And that's what he's telling them. You remember what God could do. The stones were set up as a reminder, a memorial for everyone to see, so that if anyone asks you, why are these stones here? You are able to tell them, because God got us to this point. And then the second set of stones, in verse 9. And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests who bore the ark of the covenant stood, and they are there to this day. And so the priests who bore the ark stood in the midst of the Jordan until everything was finished that the Lord had commanded Joshua to speak to the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua, and the people hurried and crossed over. And then it came to pass, when all the people had completely crossed over, that the ark of the Lord and the priests crossed over in the presence of the people. So there the ark stood, the men holding it, until everyone was able to pass over. The ark passes over, and then what happens? The waters continued. The men of Reuben, the men of Gad, the half tribe of Manasseh crossed over armed before the children of Israel, as Moses had spoken to them, and about 40,000 prepared for war crossed over before the Lord for battle to the plains of Jericho. And on that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they had feared Moses all the days of his life. Why? Because they knew that Joshua was the right man for the job. He was preparing them. He was getting their minds focused on what lies ahead, but even more so focused on finally what many of them failed to do prior to this, to finally get connected to God the way that they needed. And you look at verse 19, the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they camped in Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up in Gilgal. And then he spoke to the children of Israel, saying, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what are these stones? Then you shall let your children know, saying, Israel crossed over this Jordan on dry land. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed over. That all the peoples of the earth may know the hand of the Lord that is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. I can just see the children, just as he said, coming up to their parents. Dad, what do these stones mean? We did that when we were children, didn't we? Things displayed in my house. I remember asking my mom. My dad had passed away early on, but I remember asking her, Mom, what does this mean? What does this mean? Because as children, we get curious, don't we? And sometimes we get too curious. What does this mean? She'd tell me, and I'd say, why? Well, it's because of this. Why? We like to ask those questions, didn't we? To drive our parents crazy. Well, why? Why? Can you see the children asking what do these stones mean? God brought us to this point. Well, why? So that we could go into Canaan. Why? Because he had a plan for us. And here we are in our spiritual lives. Understanding the purpose of the stones. And how relevant it even is to us to this day. You see, the Lord's church are the standing stones today. And it is a reminder to others what God can do. You look over at 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5. This is an encouraging letter to a group of persecuted Christians. Peter wrote these two letters to people that were being attacked, Christians that were wondering if this is going to be the last day that I'm going to spend on this earth before someone rips me out of my home or kills my family or takes me and burns me at the stake just for what I believe in. They were Christ followers. But Peter writes this letter to them, and how encouraging this must have been to them, the very same way that it must have been encouraging to those people crossing over that Jordan and placing those stones down and saying, what are these stones? It's God working for you. It's God leading the way in front of you and doing things that you never even thought possible that you could get through and do on your own. But Peter writes in his letter, ye also, you, as lively stones, are built up a spiritual house. How interesting it is that stones are used as these visual aids. It was stones that were used in that day to remind people that God was in control. And here Peter is writing, using stones as a visual aid once again, saying, you are lively stones. So you're not those stones. You are a stone that's much more significant. You're heaven bound. You're built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. Folks, when we look at what the church is today, every single person that has been baptized into Christ is a stone that represents something. It's a reminder of what God is capable of doing and the promise that God makes to every person who is in Christ. Every person who has that relationship with Him is that lively stone. And we see these reminders all over, don't we, when we look at it, when we look at His Bible, when we read His Bible. And not just those Bibles. There's a sign out front that says the church, the people, the called out of Christ meets here. You see, that sign is a standing stone, or it ought to be. Because when you look at something like that, it ought to remind us where we are to be spiritually. And it's not just a sign. It's a designation. It's an identification. It is telling people, you can come into these doors. You can meet here. And you're going to be among those who have that relationship with the Son of God. It's that identification of true believers with proper worship and a proper mindset. Joshua said, explain the stones. Folks, tell people why being a Christian is so rewarding. Tell them. Give them a reason to want to be a Christian. Give them a reason that they can look at us, and it is a reminder of what could happen to them. Are we going to have problems? Absolutely. Everyone's going to have those problems. But tell them that when you have a relationship with Christ, it's like no other place to be. Our hope is contingent on being added to the Christ-only church that is identified in the New Testament. And when you look at everything that he gives to us, that he commands of us to be able to have that kind of relationship, that faith that we read about, and we see that in Hebrews chapter 11 of all of these Old Testament figures. By faith, Noah built that ark. By faith, Abraham left where he did. By faith, Abel was able to give a more excellent sacrifice. And on we go by faith. And then we read of all these New Testament figures and all the disciples of Christ and the apostles and these preachers that we're able to read about in the New Testament. And all of these people connected with one commonality. They had different interests. They had different opinions, but they had one commonality. And we see that beginning in Acts chapter 2. They were Christians, disciples. That faith is a stone. It is a reminder of who we are. That confession that we are commanded to make is a reminder of who we are. That repentance, knowing that we can be forgiven, is a reminder of where we can be. That baptism is that stone, a reminder that was the day when I went down into that water, that I made that vow to God, that I'm his servant now. The world doesn't own me anymore. That's a reminder. And the life that we live, let it be a standing stone for every person that you meet, every person you want to see go to heaven. Let your life be that reminder to them.